George Orwell, who was one of my very favorite narrators, says, and so does Mahatma Gandhi and Trotsky and all these folks all say the same thing, is that if you take away hope, you have won the battle. And the day that we don't think that we can, in fact, make a difference is the day we quit the struggle. And we think we can make a difference, whether people like me at 77 or someone at 17. We have to, and we do, believe that we can move this proposition forward, the issue of racism and injustice.
Imagine you have a job that you're very good at, and you've done it for years, but suddenly your boss says that you're fired. Why? Because of who you might love? Does this make any sense? Well, it was the reality in the United States military until recently. If a soldier was a homosexual, the Army said they had to be kicked out of the service. It didn't matter how good a soldier that person was, what they did, or how long he or she had served. How do you challenge such injustice? What soldier would stand up for himself and his identity? Who would refuse to hide and insist that the military is wrong? Perry Watkins, 1948 to 1996. Sergeant Perry Watkins' mother raised him to be honest. Living in Tacoma since 1960, he never hid the fact that he was a homosexual. When Sergeant Watkins was drafted by the Army in 1967 to serve in Vietnam, he informed them that he was gay. The Army not only let him enlist, but re-enlist twice more. He performed exceptionally, with his work described as outstanding in every regard. In 1981, after 14 years of service, the Army suddenly decided to discharge Sergeant Watkins due to his homosexuality. In 1984, they finally forced him out. Sergeant Watkins knew this was wrong, so he decided to challenge the Army in court. As he said, "I'm not going to throw away 15 years of my life. What the military did was absolutely ludicrous." Sergeant Watkins endured a 9-year legal battle against this injustice, even losing his home and filing for bankruptcy. Finally, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals determined that the Army must reinstate Watkins. Judge Harry Pregerson explained, quote, "Sergeant Watkins has greatly benefited the Army and therefore the country by his military service," end quote. The court's ruling would, quote, "simply require the Army to continue to do what it has repeatedly done for 14 years, with only positive results. Re-enlist a single soldier with an exceptionally outstanding military record," end quote. The court did not rule on whether it was legal for the Army to discriminate against homosexuals, just that they would not discharge Sergeant Watkins. After his victory in 1990, Sergeant Watkins chose not to re-enlist. He instead received an honorable discharge, back pay, full retirement benefits, and a promotion to Sergeant First Class. Since Sergeant Watkins' case was one of the first to address the military's ban on gay and lesbian service members, people all over the country paid attention. Gay rights activists cheered the decision and hoped it would pave the way for more challenges to the Army's discrimination. Christopher Smith, co-chair of the Seattle Stonewall Committee for Lesbian and Gay Rights, told a reporter, quote, "The more legal protection we get, the less fear we live under. It's people like Perry Watkins who makes it better for everyone," end quote. Many other people still feared homosexuals. Steve Furman, a Washington state representative, thought homosexuality should be against the law and that it, quote, "should be looked at like we look at prostitution, drug abuse, and statutory rape," end quote. The military discharged thousands of individuals over the many years that the ban on homosexuals was in place. The United States Congress finally lifted that ban in 2011. Sergeant Watkins spent the years between 1984 and 1990 giving speeches in favor of lifting the ban on gay service members, and his remaining years after 1990 traveling the country to give speeches about his military experiences. Sergeant Perry Watkins remained true to himself and stood up for what was right, no matter the cost.
"We don't care what happens to you." Lori Jenkins felt that this is what the voters said to the gays and lesbians of Tacoma in 1989 and 1990. They had voted against adding homosexuals as a group protected from discrimination in terms of employment, housing, and public accommodation. Without this civil rights protection, employers, landlords, and others could discriminate against anyone they knew or suspected was a homosexual. Who would organize against this? Who would lead people to work together and help Tacoma understand that LGBTQ people are just as much a part of our community as anyone else? Lori Jenkins, 1964 to the present. Representative Lori Jenkins married Laura Wolf in 2013 after 25 years and one son together. Achieving the right to do so took years of hard work. Representative Jenkins has acted as a leader for gay rights in Washington while pursuing her career, eventually becoming the first openly lesbian person serving in the state legislature. Representative Jenkins started as a lawyer and currently works as the deputy director of the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department, besides serving at the state capitol. She first came to public life as the chairperson of the City Task Force on Hate Crimes in 1990. In 1997, she headed a group proposing a state initiative that would have banned employers from discriminating against homosexuals. The measure failed, but the gay community in Tacoma built itself up, organized, and made itself visible. In 2002, the City Council added protections for homosexuals in the city's anti-discrimination law. When some tried to repeal those protections, Representative Jenkins led the fight to keep them. She called fighting for these rights and the city affirming them, quote, "the most amazing, empowering, life-changing thing I've ever been through other than having a kid. It made me incredibly proud to live in Tacoma," end quote. Finally, in 2006, the state legislature approved a bill banning discrimination based on sexual orientation in employment, housing, finance, and public accommodations. This bill had failed every year for the last 29 years. State Senator Rosa Franklin said, quote, "It's not about special rights. It's about extending rights to a group of people that have been treated badly," end quote. Elected in 2010 to the Washington State House of Representatives, Representative Jenkins acted as a leader in the push for marriage equality. She insists that every kind of family deserves respect and basic rights. Voters of the state approved the measure allowing same-sex marriage in 2012, and it became the law of the United States in 2015. Representative Jenkins also regularly speaks out for women's rights. Even in 2016, women earned only 78 cents for every dollar a man earned in Washington state, and Black and Latina women earned even less. She lists her goals for advancing equity for women as a statewide minimum wage, protected reproductive health care, equal pay for equal work, sensible paid leave, and appropriate child care policies. She calls on women to stand together and for men to support women because that will make our society better for everyone. Representative Lori Jenkins works tirelessly to make a difference. The advice she gives the community is what she follows herself. Quote, "Act, act, act. Find the thing you love and act." In January of 2020, Representative Jenkins became the first female and first LGBTQ speaker of the Washington State House of Representatives.
Well, I mean, I brought a different perspective, and, I was very aware when I ran that if I was elected, I'd be the first out lesbian serving in the state legislature. And that was something that was very motivating to me, in part because I could see that marriage equality was coming, and that I knew how important it was to our community. And I felt like it was important that there be out lesbians in addition to gay men who were leading the cause on that. But I think it was, it's interesting when you're a first, anytime you find yourself in that role, because I found myself in that role a few times, it's a very heavy burden and it's a wonderful opportunity. The heavy burden is that people place on you. Everything you do represents an entire community. Totally unfair and wrong, but that can be a very heavy burden at times because you make mistakes. You're just like everybody else, and you want people to realize that the LGBTQ community is as diverse as any other community, right? And so there's no single lesbian that can represent a whole community. I can't even represent all the lesbians, let alone the LGBTQ community. But it does provide the opportunity for, especially for folks who believe they've had very little interaction with queer people. It provides them some ability to engage and learn. And one of the stories I frequently tell is there was a Republican that I served with that I knew from prior work experience, and he was generally considered a moderate Republican. And he came over to me one day on the floor and said, because whenever I would give speeches that would call on the floor, that would call for a kind of a discussion of family or issues around kids or families, I would talk about our son and my wife and, talk about our family, and just like every other member did. And he came over to me and he said, why don't you quit giving those two mommy speeches? You're just trying to get us with those two mommy speeches. And I was kind of pleased by that. One, to think that he thought it had negative repercussions for him. I thought, okay, well, that's kind of good. But then I said to him, this isn't about you. This isn't why I'm doing that. This is about my family, and this is about thousands of other families in Washington State, and my ability to talk about my family helps them feel seen and heard. And that's what this is about. It's not always easy for me to talk, to speak and to tell our story. I don't necessarily want to do that every minute of the day, but you have no idea the emails that I get from people saying, thank you for seeing me. Thank you for being there, because it makes me feel heard and like my family's represented. And he looked at me and he said, he goes, oh, so it's not about me. It's not about us. And I said, no, it's just not. And he's like, huh, okay. And then I really liked him. He's retired now, but every time I would give a speech after that on the floor for the rest of that session, we have floor phones right at our seats, and you can call outside or you can call other members. So every time I would finish a speech, especially if it was one in which I talked about family, I'd pick up the phone, I'd dial his desk, he would pick it up, and I would say, two mommies, and then I would hang up the phone, and he would look at me and laugh and give me a thumbs up. So there was a little bit, he never voted great on LGBTQ issues, but, I feel like there was a little bit of movement that was made there.
On July 14th, 1873, the Northern Pacific Railroad selected Tacoma to be the end or terminus of a new railroad line. The railroad would connect the Northwest to a growing train system across the nation, bringing goods and many new people across its rails. The railroad company needed workers to clear land for hundreds of miles of track, lay rail, and build towns. Railroad contractors brought in laborers from China to do the hardest work with shovels and picks. The contractors were happy to have hard workers who would do the job for very low pay. The Chinese immigrants were glad to leave the famine and poverty of China behind. 10 years later, many of the Chinese workers remained all along the west coast of the U.S. They continued to do some of the lowest paying jobs. Now that the railroad was finished, many Americans saw no use for the Chinese residents. Labor unions began accusing the Chinese people of taking jobs from white men. Newspapers printed stories that wrongly described the Chinese as unclean, dishonest, and users of drugs. George Dudley Lawson, a Tacoma journalist, described them as a menace to public health and safety, with their habits, vices, and diseases. They formed a colony of leeches, he wrote. In 1882, the federal government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, preventing most Chinese people from entering the country. In 1884, Tacoma's new city council members created a ban on hiring Chinese workers. People held meetings to protest the Chinese presence in the city. They formed committees and went to homes and businesses, bullying people into agreeing with them. The Tacoma Daily Ledger wrote in 1885, quote, "The territories of the Pacific Coast are up in arms against the hordes of Chinese labor slaves infesting them. And the war of extermination has just begun. All over the West Coast, the slogan appeared, 'The Chinese must go.'" Who in Tacoma would have the courage to speak out against this unjust treatment? Our first hero, Reverend William D. McFarland, 1851 to 1932. Reverend William D. McFarland was new to Tacoma in 1885, having been recently hired by the Presbyterian Church. He believed strongly in the rights and duties of American citizens under the law. One day, he learned that some people from the anti-Chinese movement had visited his home to see if any Chinese people worked there. That made him so upset that he decided to preach a sermon supporting the Chinese workers and shaming the anti-Chinese movement. In his sermon, Reverend McFarland insisted that Chinese people in Tacoma were not dirty or criminals, and that Americans should respect the law and order. People stood up and left the church in anger. Reverend McFarland shouted back, "That's right. If you can't take the truth about yourselves, get out. Go. Go. I will preach on till the benches are empty." In the days following his sermon, Reverend McFarland received threats on his life. For his own protection, he started wearing 2 pistols everywhere he went. His sermon was not enough. The anti-Chinese group included a judge, powerful businessmen, and even the mayor, who was himself a German immigrant, ordered the Chinese people to leave town. And by late October, nearly half of Tacoma's Chinese people had hurriedly moved away. On November 3rd, 1885, an armed and organized mob of people swarmed through the streets of Tacoma. They pounded on doors and marched the remaining Chinese to a train out of town. When Reverend McFarland saw that was happening, he cried out to a friend, "My God, Captain, is this America? Why do we stand and do nothing? I must do something." His friend stopped him, reminding him of the powerful men in the mob, telling him he would only make things worse. 2 days later, someone burned to the ground the shacks where the Chinese had lived. Removing the Chinese from Tacoma was against the law, and although the men who did so were taken in by police and appeared before a judge, they were soon released and faced no consequences. In fact, their actions were celebrated by most citizens of Tacoma. Reverend William D. McFarland went on to champion other causes, including educating deaf children. We remember him for speaking out against what was wrong, even when most people disagreed with him. In 1993, the city of Tacoma apologized for the Chinese expulsion, and community leaders worked together to create the Chinese Reconciliation Project Foundation to, quote, "promote peace and harmony in our multicultural community," unquote.
The Chinese people expelled from Tacoma in 1885 never came back. No one remained to create a Chinatown like those that still thrive in Seattle and Portland. In the late 1880s, there were more than 1,000 Chinese people in the Tacoma area. In 1990, just over 500. Many in the Asian community viewed Tacoma as unwilling to welcome them. Few people knew about what had happened to the people of Little Canton, the village of shacks built over the water where the Chinese workers lived. By the 1990s, the site held abandoned shipyard buildings and contaminated soil. The city had never apologized for rounding up the Chinese people and forcing them out of town. How could we find reconciliation after such a terrible action? Who would lead the effort to remember this event, learn from it, and not let it happen again? Teresa Pan Hosley, 1951 to the present. Teresa Pan Hosley could not believe the story of the Chinese expulsion when she moved to Tacoma from Taiwan. Quote, "I had never heard such a horrible thing in my whole life. I did not believe people would do this, especially city officials. They're supposed to protect people." End quote. Several people in Tacoma had worked for some years on the idea to create a park near the site of the former Chinese community. In 1993, the city of Tacoma finally formally apologized for removing the Chinese, calling it, quote, "a most reprehensible occurrence." In 1994, Ms. Pan Hosley, then a member of the Chinese Reconciliation Project Citizens Committee, became the president of the Chinese Reconciliation Project Foundation. It took time to find and raise enough money, but Teresa and the foundation kept working. Finally, in 2005, they broke ground for the Reconciliation Park. It opened in 2011, though it is still not entirely complete. The designers created the park in the style of a Chinese garden. It features walking paths, a bridge, landscaping, stone sculptures, and panels that tell the story of what happened to the Chinese of Tacoma in 1885. The centerpiece of the park is the Ting, a red pavilion guarded by stone lions, which was donated by Tacoma's sister city of Fushu, China. According to the foundation and Ms. Pan Hosley, the park's purpose is to inform and inspire in a place for contemplation and renewal. The Chinese garden style allows the park to help people remember what happened and to celebrate our multicultural present and future. Although many in Tacoma worked on the project, it would not exist without the unending efforts of Ms. Pan Hosley. She had the vision and determination to make it happen. In 2016, she won the Greater Tacoma Peace Prize for her leadership. The nomination described, quote, "Her main strengths as a leader are her patience, soft yet firm touch, and her ability to listen. She is a manifestation of a peacemaker, promoting enduring reconciliation and harmony." End quote. She describes herself as working to make peace through, quote, "passion, effort, sweat, and thoughtfulness." End quote. Ms. Pan Hosley has always encouraged Tacoma to acknowledge that what happened in the past is not what we want for our future. She sees the park and the action by the city in support of it as helping to build a more inclusive community. She hopes that the knowledge and reconciliation the project promotes will prevent something like the expulsion from happening again and make the city better for everyone.
I regard it as a beacon for the city of Tacoma. It's one of those things that will stand out if you're in a boat or when you drive by in a car. When each year the Reconciliation Park has a moon festival, it's possible that on the stage that's on the Ting, or the stage that's under the tent, or the stage that will some be under the multicultural pavilion that hasn't been built yet, will be interrupted by a train going by because the tracks are right there. And I have to say, everyone finds that very apt, very appropriate, because of course it connects with the very Chinese being remembered by the Reconciliation Park. Put together those two words, though, it's serious. But I think that we did the right thing by wanting this park to be a park and to appreciate it shouldn't be a shrine. So it's not a shrine. And now it may be not the Tacoma method, but the Tacoma model of a place where, yes, indeed, as Teresa foresaw, children can play. And they're not going to go through the walk in order to see the signage on the stones that George Lim built in. They're brilliant. They're not going to be doing that. They could come in the wrong way and go off here and go off there as long as their parents have an eye on them, because it is also a park. It's not meant to be a shrine. And people who were active in anti-discrimination in in Tacoma in the civil rights movement era also were part of this. And I think particularly of like Dr. George Canberra, who was a rock of the community and was very much involved in efforts to create civic rights and civil rights for African Americans. But he came to these meetings very early on because he was invited to be part of the Chinese Reconciliation Project and then the foundation that came from it, and ultimately the park. So it's of interest to me that people of various backgrounds came together and still work together to perpetuate the notion that it was exclusion and now it is inclusion.
From 1941 to 1945, World War II raged around the world. In the United States, the government put Japanese Americans and Japanese people into camps simply because they looked like our enemy. They had done nothing wrong, but the country was at war with Japan, so the government decided that these people were suspicious and dangerous. Jump ahead to the 1960s. Many poor children in Tacoma could not receive the health care they needed. Would you believe that a Japanese American person could have come out of the camps with an open heart, ready to help these children? That he would not live in anger, but with compassion for all and a drive to serve. Dr. George Tambera, 1922 to 2017. Dr. George Tambera was born in America, but that did not matter to the government during World War II. While interned in a detention camp, Dr. Tambera managed to complete his degree in pharmacology and meet his future wife, Kimmy. The government then drafted him to serve in the war as a combat medic. He stayed in the Army until 1947, then went into medical school to become a pediatrician. In 1954, Dr. Tambera started his medical practice in Tacoma, Kimmy's hometown, where he took care of children for 25 years. Even with his hard work, Dr. Tambera knew that there were many people who did not get the health care they needed. Being poor and not having insurance often prevents people from seeking medical care. In 1969, with the help of many volunteers, he started 2 free clinics, one in Shalishan and one on a hilltop. That was the start of the community health care, which now has 5 medical clinics, 3 dental clinics, and in 2016 served more than 44,000 people. In 1980, Dr. Tambera and Dr. Lawrence Larson founded Pediatrics Northwest to provide more options for care in Pierce County. Speaking of his mentor, Dr. Tambera, Dr. Larson said, "He taught us not just to care for children, but to care for the community." Pediatrics Northwest now has 27 doctors and numerous locations to fulfill Dr. Tambera and Dr. Larson's original vision. Dr. Tambera's belief that the patient always comes first continues to inspire healthcare providers all over Tacoma and Pierce County. Because of a commitment to health, Dr. Tambera always had a strong commitment to social justice. As he said, quote, "We know that each race, culture, religion, or nation has produced great men. With this knowledge, individuals can build faith, trust, and confidence in other individuals. Rather than struggle for dominance, let that effort be used to create harmony." He belonged or founded more than 40 medical and community organizations and received numerous awards. All who met him came to admire and respect him. Dr. Tambera, however, always insisted that it was all the help and support from others over the years that made the difference. Dr. George Tambera mentored many students as a tennis coach. He made a difference in countless lives and, more importantly, inspired others to do the same. Considered a hero to so many children, his children described him as, quote, "Buddhist to the core, believing and demonstrating in the practice of compassion, interdependence, gratitude, reflection, and keeping one's ego in check." Instead of living a life of bitterness, due to his wartime experience. Dr. Tambera lived a life of passion, commitment to helping his community.
And I had a wife and 2 babies and trying to get a home built. Discrimination was a big, big thing, and redlining districts and just getting a loan or going, you know, going into the bank downtown like anybody else. You've saved your money. You've bought the property. You got a good contractor. You got a good bank. But you still can't get it through. And then you discover here's some guy down there that doesn't know what it's like to be me. And he's coming from, well, you people don't pay your bills on time. Well, God damn it, I do. You know, I'm not all of you people. I do. And if you don't believe it, look at my record. But don't lump me into what your belief system is when you don't know. You know, if you look at your loan portfolio, you'd be amazed at how many of the people in your loan portfolio are black. And if not, you ought to ask yourself, why not?
Tacoma Area 3, security grade, D. There are several Negro families, 3 known, who own property and live in this area. This constitutes a sufficient hazard to justify a 4th grade rating. This is from a 1937 research agent's report and map to classify all of Tacoma's districts. He gave any section with a population of non-white people a D, 4th grade, the lowest possible. On the map, these areas were colored red. Real estate agents and banks used this map to prevent black people from buying outside of the red areas in a practice known as redlining. The Supreme Court declared this practice illegal in 1948. But in reality, non-white people, for many years after, found it nearly impossible to have a free choice of where to live. Who would insist that white people and the city of Tacoma take responsibility for their actions? Who would insist on rights for all? Jack Warnick, 1932 to the present. The terrible violence committed by white people against African Americans in the South and the horrors of the Holocaust during World War II made a strong impression on Mr. Jack Warnick while growing up in Tacoma. He equated his Jewish ancestors' slavery in Egypt to that of the Negro's history in the USA. He came to believe very deeply that he must fight against prejudice. Aware of the problem of housing discrimination in the city, Mr. Warnick volunteered for Tacoma's Urban Renewal Program. In 1962, he was selected chairman of the Housing and Social Welfare Committee. The committee listened to testimony about redlining and discrimination practices. They recommended that housing adopt an open housing ordinance. An ordinance is like a law, and establish a Human Relations Commission. Mr. Warnick gave a passionate speech to the council. Quote, "This pattern of discrimination is the fact of life in Tacoma today. And in this, the entire white community must stand condemned." The city council approved the ordinance by a 7-2 vote. However, before it went into effect, voters in 1963 overturned the measure in a referendum vote by a 3-1 majority. It was not until 1968, with the Federal Civil Rights Act, that the government made housing discrimination illegal. The City Council finally created the Human Relations Commission in 1967 and selected Reverend Ernest Brazil as its first chairperson. The commission could not do much work until 1970, however, when Tacoma voted against the mayor who opposed the commission and recalled 5 problematic city council members. Mr. Warnick served on the commission from 1971 to 1973, when voters elected him to the city council. Mr. Warnick served 4 terms on the council, including 2 terms as deputy mayor. While on the council, he and Harold Moss insisted that the Human Relations Commission become the Human Rights Commission to have a stronger impact. They successfully worked to include homosexuals as needing protection from discrimination. It took a long time, but the council did finally make these changes. The commission has now served Tacoma for 50 years. In 2017, former Mayor Bill Barsma wrote about Jack Warnick, quote, "It was he who for decades took the lead in advocating for those people in our community who were discriminated against," end quote. Mr. Jack Warnick's commitment to justice and action for a better Tacoma created lasting change and still impacts the city today.
I think that I had a certain value system that made this important, whether it's from American government classes or whatever it was that made it so important. I came from a household, both of my parents had older brothers and sisters who were born in Europe. My grandparents were all immigrants from Europe. They ran from Europe because of the persecution of Jews, the intolerance that they had to face. I was aware of it. I didn't experience it here, certainly, but I was aware of the background and what had taken place with the pogroms and the violence that was so much a part of their life and was continuing now. The same kinds of problems were not against Jews so much as against all minority groups, and I felt it was wrong, and that was probably the motivation.
So we wanted to buy a house, and of course, for me, that was one of the things also with us. And my family was always owning your own home and being stable, because for them it presented stability. And for us, I still see that you must have stability in your life, even though my husband was in the military. So when I looked in the paper back in those days, newspaper and whatever, and then had called an agent that I wanted to go to look for a house, because we weren't making very much money in the first place, but I had seen places that I really wanted to live and wanted to, not for somebody else to tell me where to live. So after I made the appointment for the agent to come, and he drove up, and of course, when I opened the door and he saw who I was, then he was sort of backing up, and I just invited him in. And began to, because he saw that I was an African-American woman, and I think he didn't really want to deal with me, and he didn't want to really take me where I wanted to go. And then when I brought him in and I met to him, now, my husband is in the military. He is there defending all of the country. It didn't regardless of color, out there in the bad weather and the snow. And we're here, and I want to buy the house, and I want to go where I want to go. And he said, well, I will find your house if I have to sell you my house.
Wow.
And so then we went out and we bought those houses, but we ended up with the house we can afford, and believe it was on 1041 South Prospect. I didn't know anything about any redlining or anything like that, but having lived in New York, we know growing up in the South, there's overt discrimination. We would see over the doors, colored only. Or you'd go into the railroad, it's colored only. They were all visible segregation, but then when you come with this covert cover-up segregation, And it was going on in Tacoma, and I found out that it was not just within housing, it was in schools, it was in employment, it was in other areas. So that in turn, because coming from a background of social justice and seeing that does not work for me. So that in turn was my first real confrontation in regards to discrimination in Tacoma.
So, just think, as I think about the whole era of redlining, I think about that it wasn't just a momentary thing. It has had generational effects. What we know about home ownership and building equity, that it has been the most reliable and most consistent way of building generational wealth. And so the inability to do that for decades has really resulted in lower personal wealth and generational wealth in Black communities. And we see all kinds of expressions of that. The wealth jump differential, regardless of people's income level, that there's still that stark difference in wealth accumulation for the white population, and especially African Americans, but also other people of color. And what's so detrimental about the redlining, in part, there's the access to building wealth through equity, but also what happened to the homes, being trapped in neighborhoods where you were a renter, not an owner, and that the owners were absentee landlords who were anxious to maximize their wealth by extracting from the properties and not returning, not building on those properties, not doing the upkeep and things like that. That's why the neighborhoods where African Americans, people of color, lower income residents inhabit look like they do, not because there's anything inherently wrong with the population. It's not because of personal choices that they've made. It's that they've been paying their rent for 40 years on a house they don't own, or a series of houses that they don't own, where the landlords have been maximizing their return by not putting back into the properties, which then so then we got to the place where there's this urban renaissance, where people are wanting to move back into inner ring communities. We want to live in the inner city. It's closer to downtown. Downtown is no longer noisy and polluted, and because all of that industry has left, right, and moved to the suburbs, or has been offshored. And so people are wanting to come back into urban neighborhoods. There are these quaint but under-invested properties that can be picked up very inexpensively by people wanting to come from the suburbs into the city. And as a result, you've got this massive displacement going on. We talk about it, we call it gentrification, but that is just people coming in and snapping up these properties, investing in them, and the rise in the property values as a result kind of deflects the population that has lived there and worked to make those livable communities, right, to get them through the the disorganization that happened as a result of the underinvestment. So there's both sides to that coin: the inability to move out of these neighborhoods for lack of access to capital, but also the practices of the real estate industry that kind of, you know, well, like Harold's story, like Mr. Moss's story, Mayor Moss. So we've got, you know, this combination of factors going on, and so we, you know, so it shows up in lots of ways today, even though it was a practice that we like to point to as a historical practice, but there's still vestiges of, you know, there's study after study currently that shows that African Americans don't have the same access to the real estate markets. So some of it is a result of some of the steering, what's called steering practices of the, you know, we could say that it's individual realtors, but it's institutional, right? I mean, it is a factor that is practiced by the industry.
Knowing that I was going into that challenge, you do a lot of praying. And you do a lot of thinking about it. You take it to bed with you at night and you wake up with it in the morning. And you say, I can do this. I've got to do this. Kids need to be educated and educated right. Parents need to know that I can do this job. I can do this. And so I have to convince myself of right and wrong, and make a commitment that I'm put here for some reason, whatever that reason is, and make a commitment to myself and to everyone that America stands for everybody. Everybody.
You know, and I don't think, I've never been somebody who thinks that we should compare oppressions. There are lots of different communities who have been oppressed, and it's all bad. It's all bad. But now is a moment in time when Black people in Washington and the United States are, I guess I feel like my job in this is to try to expand voices and expand the space so that Black people can finally lead, which I think that's been one of the hugest challenges, is that Black people have been excluded from leadership in so many ways. And so, you know, as Speaker of the House, a lot of the work that I'm doing is I will not claim credit, nor should I, for approaches that you'll see us take during the next legislative session. It is our Black Members Caucus that's leading, and my job is to make sure that I do what I can to help clear the path so that they can do that, and that impediments aren't put in their way. And I'm very excited about it, because the other thing that I've seen in history is when Black people lead, it does better for everybody. The whole world gets to be a better place. And so the oppression that I face as a lesbian is lessened, and my world is improved when Black people have the space to lead and to find solutions. So that's a big part of this for me. But I would say that one of the other things is, you know, I'm 55 years old this year. When I was in my 20s and came out, I didn't want to be married, because I couldn't imagine that would ever be an option that would be presented to me. So it wasn't even a desire that I had. And then, you know, in 2012, which was 8 years ago, so I was 48, we were able to be married. And so, and I think about that provides me with so much hope about what's going on right now, because I literally lived in the course of my lifetime not even being able to imagine the existence of something, and then having that something. And that gives me great hope about what we can accomplish if we keep focused on it and we keep moving forward. And so I am very hopeful and excited about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I want to be a really, I'm very committed to anti-racism. I'm very clear that I'm not perfect. And I got a lot of room for improvement. But I'm going to do everything I can to improve myself and improve the world, following behind, especially the great Black leaders that are out there leading the way.
People need to be, I would say, more open-doored, more open about getting together and discussing issues. And knowing your neighbor and knowing each other and not being so, closing your doors, and learning about each other, learning about other cultures, learning about other people, and don't try to bury your history, because that's what has happened. People who have made the city or the country got shut out and weren't given their due or recognition of what part they play. And it's just like, what happened when during World War II, when the Japanese then was put into place. And what happened to the Chinese? And then what happened to African Americans? What happened to people of color in general?
Right.
And so we have to own up to anything that was done to somebody else and talk about it. And then we learn to respect each other, and we learn to listen, and we learn to compromise. How do you compromise without losing your principles? And the legislature had to do that.
Right.
I had to compromise, but I didn't lose I lived by my principles. And so in Tacoma's come a long way, but I still see closed doors. The doors are not as open as it should be. We've made progress, but a lot of times we talk a lot, but we don't have action. And so from coming here in 1954 to where we are now in 2020, where the city died.
Yes.
And the city died because of the lack of leadership. And then I came back after we left, and we came back, and there was a hilltop. And I said, hilltop? What in the world is that? That was the central city. And yet it's right within throwing range of the business district in downtown.
Yes.
And they let it die.
Yes.
And now gentrification is taking place, and the people who have lived there are being pushed out. And we have I drive through, I see all the homelessness and things that we had done before in order to make it better was not sustained. So it's the sustainability when we do things, which should be sustainability. We should be able to respect each other. We should have open door to each other. And that Tacoma is small enough that we can do that.
And so I hope, probably not in my lifetime, but I hope that as we evolve, that we can make the American experience become something that's very special. And I continue with that hope, and that's what keeps me suiting up, showing up, and engaging the process, and in just enjoying the people who have come to this part of the political experience, to see the growth, the knowledge, the passion, the desire to do something different, and do it in a different way that is just and humane, and acknowledge that many of the things that we have, from the top of the economic spectrum all the way down to the bottom are not properly, don't have the correct distribution. And people will figure it out. I hesitate in labeling stuff because these are my labels and they're my experience. And I think it's important in this interview, but it is more important for people to engage and learn and figure out, have lived experiences that inform them about how to proceed.
Well, I think one of the issues with Western thinking is that we see history as a linear process, as opposed to many Indigenous peoples see history as more circular, or even certainly not linear. So when we think about sort of the amazing work of the fish wars in the 1950s and the 1960s, in fact, so much of that was started the day after we signed the Medicine Creek Treaty, right? So none of these bigger media events, which are deeply, deeply important to motivation and to getting certain laws passed, are part of just the history. They're just there. We are, even when things aren't in newspapers, there's always people at the front lines fighting for this, fighting for our sovereignty, fighting for our rights, our civil rights. So what we can learn, and sort of what you just sort of gestured out earlier, is that none of these things are happening in a vacuum. People are always fighting, and at times they get more media attention, but at no point are people not fighting.